You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Satu Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center and the Director of the East-West Center in Washington. This morning, we have Ambassador Tom Hubbard and Dr. Renato Cruz de Castro with us for a wonderful program on transforming the Philippine-U.S. alliance into a security partnership. We're delighted to have you join us today for what I know is going to be a terrific program given the speakers and their expertise and background and experience. As you well know, the East-West Center in Washington has been doing a 60 Minutes for the 60th Anniversary series of webinars from our illustrious alumni from around the region in the United States. And today, we're delighted to have Renato de Castro back. He was a ASEAN East-West Center U.S.-ASEAN Fulbright Initiative researcher with us in the fall of 2016. And we have kept in very close touch over the years prior to that and after that. And we're delighted to welcome Renato back. As many of you know, he's a professor in the International Studies Department at De La Salle University. And he, in fact, holds a chair in Philippine-American relations as well. He's had extensive experience analyzing regional geostrategic, political, foreign affairs issues. Many of you will be familiar with his abundant writings, very worthwhile writings. And engagements in conferences and briefings. And then, of course, we have Ambassador Tom Hubbard, who will be familiar to many of you as well, a long-serving American diplomat who is in his new role as Senior Director of McLarty Associates Asia Practice. And of course, he was ambassador to a United States ambassador to the Philippines from 1996 to 2000 and had a pivotal role in many of the key developments in the U.S.-Philippine alliance. So with that background, I welcome you all. We will have approximately 30 to 40 minutes from our presenters, and then we will go to Q&A. As the protocol mentioned, we are live stream on YouTube. The program is entirely on the record. And so I will read the questions when we go to Q&A because our YouTube colleagues cannot see those questions. And that also avoids Tom Hubbard and Renato having to read them and keep track of them, etc. With that, let me welcome you all. And Renato, good morning. May I ask you please to lead off with your PowerPoint and your comments, and then we'll turn to Ambassador Hubbard.
Good morning for some, good evening for others, but
Yes.
to all, I hope everyone is safe and healthy. So I'll just give you a background regarding my presentation. I wrote a paper just after you have the suspension of the visiting forces agreement, and at that time I was very concerned that it could basically lead to a breakdown. So I decided to write a paper, and this is my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so my presentation is about looking at the possibility of trying to salvage an alliance that was under a crisis at the time that the visiting forces had been, announced to be terminated, into a possible security partnership. So let me start by what happened early February when, of course, you have President Duterte directing the Foreign Secretary to formally inform the United States Embassy in Manila that he's terminating the visiting force agreement. The treaty provides that after, of course, you have the announcement, the decision to terminate it, the termination will take effect 180 days. So a day prior before that, the Philippine Senate already came out with a sort of resolution requesting the president to reconsider the decision on abrogating the visiting forces agreement. At the time, of course, you have Secretary Locsin doing his presentation, Secretary Lorenzana, and all of them were basically telling the alliance, the visiting forces agreement is very important to the Philippines. They came out with the resolution which articulated the argument of Secretary Locsin. The alliance is very important because of defense arrangement, also because of the fact that we value American military assistance, especially American equipment, because they are, it comes along with a total package in contrast to what's being offered, let's say, by Russia and by China. And of course, everyone knows that President Duterte has been trying to get or source weapons from Russia, killer-class submarines from Russia, weapons from China, and the AFP would always say, no, the best deal we get is from the United States. So that time, the presidential spokesperson said, this is just the beginning. Eventually, of course, President Duterte is looking at the possibility of abrogating not only the Visiting Forces Agreement, but of course the Mutual Defense Treaty, and of course even the Enhanced Defense Cooperation of 2014. And of course, by directing the decision, his decision to terminate the Visiting Forces Agreement, as warned by Secretary Locsin, terminating the Visiting Force Agreement would render the Mutual Defense Treaty and the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement into mere pieces of paper, because the BFA is an implementing agreement. So in the light, of course, of this crisis that happened in February, let's look at the possibility of transforming the alliance into a security partnership, and more importantly, raising the issue: is the security partnership a viable alternative to the Philippine-U.S. alliance? I'll just go through a brief discussion of what's the difference between an alliance and of course a security partnership. And I get a what I would call a textbook definition by Stephen Walt. An alliance is a formal or informal arrangement for security cooperation between two sovereign states. Alliances pull their resources together in pursuit of mutual interests, usually in the form, of course, of a third party. Alliance explicitly or implicitly define the terms under which they combine their security resources, so forth and so on. And of course, the primary essence of an alliance is a commitment to assist an ally. You're bound to basically provide assistance ally either in terms of military assistance, or if push comes to shove, basically joining the fray, providing troops, forces. What's the security partnership? It's a relationship wherein, of course, security partners strengthen their respective capabilities, but without any commitment to assist each other. So it's a lower form of a security relation. Security strategic partnership are informal alliances, or in fact, it's using the term alliance might be a misnomer. Some scholars would use the term alignment, because again, there's no commitment to assist each other. What basically bound you is the fact that you face a common threat, but you simply don't give promises, or more importantly, you do not pool resources. And it's usually you still conduct activities that are conducted in alliances, periodic meetings, joint exercises, so forth and so on. But however, of course, security partners need not make any mutual pledge or commitment to come into each other's assistance. We're basically on our own. Push comes to shove, I've given you my assistance, you're on your own. There's no need for them to pull the resources together, since, of course, there's no formal commitment to assist each other. So, of course, you have several cases. States enter into security partnership because they fear losing their autonomy. They don't want to be tied to a great power, and they're not willing to accept the cost that would be incurred by strengthening one's relation with one great power. A very good example here, of course, is Vietnam. Vietnam, of course, is a security partner of the United States, but I don't think that it will ever happen in our lifetime that Vietnam would be an ally of the United States, primarily because Vietnam is still very sensitive to how China would react if you have, of course, a U.S.-Vietnamese alliance. Of course, also, the Vietnamese are very much independent-minded people. No way, dude. So I'll just go to my point. Let's look at basically the key issue when we talk about the alliance, especially, of course, after the basis. U.S. forces left the Philippines in November 1992. The very essence, of course, is the issue of security guarantee as provided by the Mutual Defense Treaty, the first Mutual Defense Treaty that was signed by the United States here in Asia. And of course, this was in the context of the Korean War, and at the time that the United States was about to return its sovereignty back to Japan. So the Mutual Defense Treaty extends security guarantee to the Philippines, something that the Filipino leaders then were asking the United States, despite the fact that the country was already hosting American military bases. The Mutual Defense Treaty was preceded the Military Bases Agreement of 1947. But of course, the Mutual Defense Treaty, as any other treaties within what we call the San Francisco system of bilateral alliances, does not provide any automatic response clause. Kind of different from NATO. The Mutual Defense Treaty only obligates the allies to consult each other and determine what military or diplomatic action, if any, would undertake. Of course, U.S. officials has assured their Filipino counterparts and critics of the Mutual Defense Treaty, as you know, as early as time that you have the Senate debate, that Washington would not there was always a question whether Washington would honor its security commitment, given the fact that there's no legal clause providing for immediate response, just in case you have, of course, a push comes to shove situation. Now let's just look into what you call the alliance security dilemma and how this became accentuated during the time of the Aquino administration. This was, of course, around 2011. So all alliances are afflicted by what you call the alliance security dilemma. Will my ally provide me assistance in a push come to shove situation, despite you have this security, this commitment? This refers, of course, to the allies' constant fear of either abandonment and entrapment. Of course, the other side doesn't want to be pulled into a conflict that is none of its concern. So this is, of course, the case in all alliances, not very specific to the Philippine-U.S. security relation. But of course, this became accentuated in 2011 when, for the first time, in the aftermath, of course, of a crisis between the Philippines and China. This was around June 2011, when for the first time, the Aquino administration raised the possibility that it might invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty. So during that time, you have assurances from key up to the level of President Obama that the commitment is ironclad. Again, of course, with at that time, I still remember June 2011, you have Ambassador Harry Thomas basically saying, we're in this together, where allies will be consulting each other. Then no less than Secretary Hillary Clinton on board the USS Gerald that was docked in Manila Bay, that the United States would honor its Mutual Defense Treaty. Then when President Obama visited Manila in April 2014, he declared our commitment to the Philippines is ironclad. The Philippines will keep that commitment because we're allies, never stand alone. Then again, on board, symbolically on board a former U.S. Coast Guard cutter that was given to the Philippine Navy, when he said we have a treaty obligation and ironclad commitment to the defense of the ally, and you can count on the United States. Of course, the Filipino critics would always phrase that you don't basically give that there will be an automatic reaction, just in case you have the push comes to shove situation. And the U.S. policy then is to address legitimate Philippine concern about the absence of clear guarantee of an armed confrontation, but of course, avoiding providing what we call the blank check, any security guarantee, primarily because it does not want to provoke China, and of course, embolden the Philippines to challenge or make generate certain interests that could basically pull the United States into a conflict that's none of its business, especially during that time. What the United States offered them, of course, was the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement that was negotiated for 2 years that would provide for temporary access to American forces in 5 Philippine air bases. It also became controversial. It took about 2 years before the Philippine Supreme Court came out with a decision. Now let me shift into what changed. During the time of the Aquino administration, it was asking for clearer security guarantee, but the guarantee itself was never challenged. This, of course, totally changed with the current administration. So President Duterte, of course, showed that, for him, what is important is China. The Philippines should always be sensitive to China's security interests. And, he did not push for example, the implementation of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. So the Duterte administration initiated efforts to show its sensitivity to Chinese security interests as he watered down the initial efforts of the Aquino administration to strengthen the alliance, halting Philippine-U.S. joint naval patrol, limiting the number of scope of interaction military exercises, and of course even threatening to terminate the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. In May 2018, For the first time in its history, the Republic of the Philippines came out with a national security strategy. So the national security strategy paints a very realist picture of the country's external environment, of great powers clashing, and the fact that the Philippines is located in a very strategic part of the world. It notes that the Philippines has not been confronted with any direct threat of foreign aggression since the Second World War, but of course this has ended in this, in the second decade of the 21st century. The national security strategy of the Philippines observed, and this in a way I believe is a reflection of the worldview of the current president, that the United States is finished. Pax Americana is over. Geographic strategic competition is basically ensured that Russia and China are the powers to reckon with. But of course, it's always afraid of a possibility that there will be a great power armed confrontation. The national security strategy calls for the Philippines to adopt a more nuanced and flexible approach in dealing with the great powers in the region. It proposes the Philippines must chart, it's supposed to be the basis, doctrinal basis for an independent foreign policy in a world that's supposed to be already multipolar, in contrast to being unipolar. While at the same time, this is kind of push and pull element there. At the same time, it calls for a need to strengthen and pursue comprehensive strategic alliance and cooperation with Philippine friends and partners. So you see this sort of tension within this national security strategy. And it provides a strategic basis or doctrinal basis for President Duterte Administration to pursue their efforts to solidify ever closer relations with China, while at the same time strategically distancing the Philippines from the United States. Duterte administration raised the prospect of a joint development with China. It mentioned it several times. At the same time, he gave statement implying that the Philippines will not get involved in any military dispute between China and the United States in the South China Sea. No less than the presidential spokesperson announced it several times. Push comes to shove, we would maintain our neutrality. Of course, this is a different, we can discuss basically what accounts for this. In December 2018, Philippine Secretary of Defense Delfin Lorenzana raised the proposal for a review of the Mutual Defense Treaty, whether this is still important to the Philippines or not. They raised issues just in case you have a conflict between the United States and China in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. This might drag the Philippines into a conflict. We believe it's time for us to basically sit down. So for some of the things, the goal is either, of course, to maintain, strengthen, or even look at the possibility of scrapping the Mutual Defense Treaty. In a way, this reflects a fear on the part of the defense establishment, but at the same time, this is also directed to the current administration that, what if the United States would offer us a clearer security guarantee? There's no point in becoming very cynical or skeptical regarding the alliance. So there's, of course, a race despite the ironclad. Then you have, of course, the statement of Secretary Michael Pompeo when he visited Manila in March 2009, which is actually not new. It simply reiterated the Mutual Defense Treaty in a different context. Then you have, of course, the visit of U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper visited Manila, and you have a discussion. At the time, Secretary Esper was telling Manila, be more vocal about what's happening in the South China Sea in terms of Chinese assertiveness, Chinese aggression. So let's look at what happened basically at the time of the crisis. At the start of 2020, the alliance was actually in a stable state. You have, of course, a visit by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and I failed to mention about what happened in Balikatan 2019, wherein at the onset of his term, President Duterte said, I don't want any military exercises that would be conducted in the South China Sea and will have war scenario, projecting war scenarios. This, of course, did not happen with Balikatan 2019. It happened near Zambales, and you have, of course, two sides basically projecting, trying to recapture an island that's been occupied by a hypothetical terrorist or an enemy state. So this concern, caused concern, of course, in Beijing. the foreign minister spokesperson talked about this military alliance. This was around April 2019. At that time, of course, unfortunately, of course, President Duterte does not share his military positive view of the alliance. In fact, he was alarmed by the Armed Forces of the Philippines' active agenda of joint exercises with the United States that have, of course, war-fighting scenarios, which he told the AFP at the start of his term, I don't want war-fighting scenarios. But this happened in Balikatan 2019. But at the same time, he was telling the Armed Forces of the Philippines, I want you to have joint exercises with the Chinese. When President Xi Jinping visited Manila around November 2018, it was expected they'll be signing agreements. Armed Forces of the Philippines will be signing agreements with the PLA about certain military cooperation. Not a single agreement was signed. I think the AFP dug its heels to the ground in terms of security cooperation with China in total, in a way, non-compliance to the instruction from the president. So President Duterte said in an interview with a Russian television, he's afraid that the conflict in the South China Sea would crush with the Philippines. And according to him, the problem is you have American forces here in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and they would take advantage of the conflict and will be caught in the middle. Of course, the excuse that was given was the visa, the cancellation of visa of one of the senators. Probably that's the tip of the iceberg, but I think it's something to do more of his concern. So he openly expresses fears of intervention by the United States that would push any conflict in the South China Sea in unforeseen situation. And of course, terminating. So what happened? This is basically my point. From an alliance to a security partnership. So the Philippine-U.S. alliance, of course, a deep crisis in February 2020. Termination of BFA would affect more than 300 joint trainings activities. But of course, it's now moot and academic because the pandemic has suspended all those military activities. Aside from, of course, you have effects on two allies' military activities and also hamper U.S. military operations such as freedom of navigation of patrols in the South China Sea. Instead, of course, unraveling the overall security relationship, as might be envisioned by President Duterte, the Philippines and the United States might consider downgrading their alliance into a security partnership. So through a security partnership, both countries can still engage in periodic security meetings, consultation, joint exercises, other limited defense-related activities without a formal defense treaty. Both security partners are not required to extend mutual pledge to come to each other's assistance to enter one's commitment. Basically, there's no more point in the Philippines raising, we will be dragged into a conflict with the United States. No, it's gone. It's finished. There will be no concern that the United States will be dragged by the Philippines in a push-comes-to-shove situation in the South China Sea. No more commitment whatsoever. Instead of a formal treaty commitment to extend military assistance to each other, security partners would settle for a loose form of alignment that is simply signaling a device of a big means of mutual assurances. Of course, both countries had several security partnerships. The Philippines has security partnerships with Australia, with Japan, with South Korea, with India. The United States, of course, also has several security partnerships. This will require either the suspension or if push comes to shove, the abrogation of the Mutual Defense Treaty, and is replaced by a joint communique or a declaration of understanding that there exists a security partnership between the United States and the Philippines. In the case of Philippine-Japan Security Partnership, it's just a communique that came out in June 2015 after the state visit of President Aquino, then President Aquino. So all actions, of course, in the world have trade-offs. If the Philippines would consider this is something it would have to take into account. Number one, of course, the Philippines would lose the alliance deterrence effect. The very essence of the alliance is not the military assistance you get from your allies, the periodic military exercises that you conduct, consultation, so forth. It's when push comes to shove where alliances really do matter, when alliance would provide you assistance. In the case, of course, of the Philippines alliance with the United States, theoretically speaking, the entire might of the most powerful armed forces of the world is behind the Philippines. I think this is the reason why China has not touched the BRP Sierra Madre we only have about 7 or 8 Marines there, or basically contemplating on pushing the Philippines out of Pag-asa Island, because the Chinese are very much aware that behind that dilapidated landing ship tank or a Second World War vintage patrol aircraft the Philippine Navy got is, of course, the deterrence effect, the guarantee, security guarantee, theoretically by the most powerful armed force in the world, and of course by the only superpower in the world. And of course, this will lead to dramatic pressure to increase the Philippines' defense budget, which at this point in time is only about 0.9%. So this will lead to more pressure. And of course, as what happened when the bases left in the 1990s, at the time the Armed Forces of the Philippines planned for a modernization program. This was during your term, Ambassador, in the 1990s. After the last Marine left Subic, the Philippine Armed Forces of the Philippines came out with a modernization program. Nothing happened out of that modernization program because money that's supposed to be allocated for the modernization program had to be reallocated for operations and maintenance of existing equipment of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. This will happen again. So there goes the budget, the 25 billion peso budget that's allocated for the Armed Forces of the Philippines modernization program. It had to be reverted back to the general budget for defense, for maintenance, for operation, and for the salary of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And of course, based on the surveys conducted by both the Social Weather Station and Pulse Asia, Filipinos generally trust the United States. They have a great distrust of China, and in contrast to the government, I think 65% of Filipinos, based on the survey of the Social Weather Stations, believe that the United States would honor its treaty commitment to the Philippines. So it will not have great support from the public. And this is my conclusion. So current crisis alliance provide opportunities for both countries to reflect on the importance of the alliance. The Philippines should examine possible choices, abrogation or business as usual, or transformation to security partnership. I think this will not only hold this did not only hold true in February, probably after you have this election in November. Both sides, just in case you have a change in administration in Washington, D.C., there'll be a reflection on whether it's still worthwhile to maintain an alliance with a treaty ally that basically declared that it will remain neutral if push comes to shove in the South China Sea. But of course, in examining those options, the Philippines should take into account the following: the deterrence effect of the alliance. In this alliance, this is an alliance with the only superpower in the world, with the most powerful armed forces in the world. Its impact on defense spending, which will affect ordinary Filipinos, especially given the fact that the economy has suffered a great decline in the light of the pandemic, in the light of the longest lockdown conducted by this administration, although about 60 or 70 days. Economy's unemployment rate is supposed to be around 45%, and this was, of course, based on the Social Weather Station, and of course, current program of the AP modernization program, which had there's some progress with this modernization program. Acquisition of 2 FA-50s from South Korea, acquisition of 2 frigates. But then once you have, of course, the budget for the modernization drying up, how would you maintain those equipment? How could you buy more support equipment for those frigates, for those lead-in fighter planes, and of course, taking into account the sentiment and interests of the Filipino nation, who still generally think that the United States is a trustworthy ally and an ally that would honor its commitment, in contrast to how they view, of course, China. I'll be ending my presentation by referring to Prime Minister Churchill when he was reflecting in the 1950s that alliance with the United States that was, of course, very troubled, also for both sides. At least one thing's worse than fighting with allies is that to fight without them. I end my presentation here, and I look forward to Ambassador Hubbard's interesting, enlightening remarks.
Thank you very much, Renato. Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. And now we'll turn to Ambassador Hubbard.
Well, thank you, Satu. I'm very pleased to be here for this discussion today, and once again be with my my friend Renato, with whom I have shared the platform on several different occasions, both in Manila and in the United States. When I want to first congratulate Renato on his PowerPoint graphics. I could. One of the things I've always admired about Filipinos is their ability to do these graphics, and my talk will be very dull by comparison. But when I first saw your description of your program today, I almost thought Renato had gone over to the other side. That he seemed to be in some way advocating a downgrading of our U.S.-Filipino alliance to what he's called a strategic partnership. I immediately thought that would be a huge mistake, and thought I would be spending my time on this panel trying to dissuade him of this new view. But his conclusion leads me to believe that, as has long been true, we agree on the fundamental importance of the defense relationship and the mutual defense treaty. I was involved with the Philippines dating back to the end of the Marcos era in the early 1980s, and was first assigned to Manila as Deputy Chief of Mission in 1990, just as we entered into the bases negotiation that led to the closure of our military bases, our permanent bases in the Philippines. And we went into during that negotiation and in the times prior to that, much of the public focus and much of the governmental focus had been on the bases treaty, rather than the later 1951 mutual defense treaty that actually is the basis of our alliance. And as we went through the very frustrating negotiation of a renewed bases treaty, only to see it supported by the Philippine government under Cory Aquino and then rejected by the Philippine Senate, there was a temptation to say, hey, all is lost. This alliance is going down the tubes. And I think I was one of those people who said, wait a minute, we just lost the bases treaty, but we still have a mutual defense treaty, which, as Renato has said, entails mutual defense commitments, which are valuable, we think, for the United States. Our assessment then was it was still valuable for the Philippines in the global context. And shouldn't we, instead of wringing our hands about losing the bases, start thinking practically about how we could keep the alliance meaningful by finding ways to preserve our military cooperation. We found training in the Philippines quite valuable. We still thought our bases there at Subic and Clark were valuable. But we could find ways to work around that. But we did think it was important for our armed forces to stay in touch, for us to have joint exercises and ship visits. And so much of the ensuing years for me with the Philippines were spent on trying to find ways and procedures and agreements by which we could continue that military cooperation without bases. And that's what I spent 7 years in the Philippines, 3 years as Deputy Chief of Mission during the bases negotiation. I went back some 3.5 years later as ambassador. And one of the first things that presented itself to me was the need for some sort of agreement that provided for the entry and exit, the procedures enabling our forces to enter the Philippines and cooperate with Filipinos. And that's what led to the Visiting Forces Agreement, which of course was the agreement that that President Duterte first attacked on our when he decided he wanted to diminish the relationship with the United States. And the VFA is important. I was very pleased when President Duterte suspended his decision to abrogate that agreement. I think that would have been a huge mistake because along with the MDT, the Mutual Defense Treaty, the VFA is a way of ensuring that our mutual commitments have some meaning, that our armed forces are able to cooperate together. It has, as Renato has said, been of very practical importance to the Philippines in terms of military cooperation, in terms of dealing with the issues in Mindanao surrounding Islamic terrorism. I might note, I noticed in the New York Times this morning that there's been a big explosion in Mindanao and the island of Jolo, killing a large number of Philippine military and police as well as civilians. And that is a reminder that that problem still exists, and the MDT and the VFA have been a mechanism by which we've been able to assist in that counter terrorism effort in Mindanao. But probably most importantly, Renato talked about the deterrent effect of the MDT, of the alliance. But I would kind of raise that to a higher strategic level. It is not only an element of deterrence, but partly as that, it's also a sign, a symbol of the U.S. continued commitment to peace and security in the East Asian region. I think for the MDT to be downgraded in any way would be, I think, the wrong signal to a very aggressive China, which is continuing its efforts to build up its military capability in the region. It would be the wrong signal to our strategic partners like Singapore, perhaps Malaysia, Vietnam, others in the region. It would be a sign of withdrawal from the region, which would be, I think, very harmful to the long-term interests both of the Philippines and the United States. So I don't think this is a good time to downgrade the alliance, and I think, in fact, President Duterte recognized that in deciding to suspend his abrogation of the VFA, which is one of the main operating commitments under that. We used to hear a lot about, that somehow the U.S. military presence in the Philippines being a lightning rod for, bringing external disputes into the Philippines. I think that thinking maybe had some validity back when we actually had bases in the Philippines. But somehow I don't think it has any validity today when we don't have military bases in the Philippines that could attract some kind of attack. I think it is our temporary presence, our cooperation is a viable positive factor in our presence in the region and in securing Philippine security. But I see it as a source of stability rather than a potential tripwire or lightning rod. And I think the other nations in the region, starting with our other treaty allies like Japan, Korea, Australia, all of whom are cooperating with the Philippines in one way or another. In fact, even have visiting forces agreements with the Philippines. I think it would be seen as a sign of instability rather than a positive sign, and would be a very big mistake. Let me just say to Renato and the other Filipinos, for America, these treaty alliances, the so-called, the San Francisco series of agreements, are something sacred. we do take our commitments very, very seriously under that. As Renato points out, each of these, our commitments and each of these agreements are somewhat different, but they have the same basis. That is that we recognize that we have common interests that need to be supported. We need to cooperate in balancing them. None of our agreements, certainly our agreement with the Philippines, doesn't specify that the U.S. would automatically react militarily to any kind of attack from outside on either the Philippine territory or on its vessels and other the vessels and aircraft in the Pacific. Doesn't specify that we would respond militarily, but it does specify that we would act to support the common interest in various other ways that allies can act together to forestall forces. So I think the MDT is something important to keep. I also think the VFA and the later the EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, are worthy elements of our common defense and symbols of our common purpose and interests, and these should be preserved. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Hubbard. I was, one of the fascinating things about Renato's title that he proposed for this was moving to a security partnership. So I was expecting more dissonance when we planned this program. But since there's so much alignment, I do want to ask a question before I turn to the Q&A section. I mean, the U.S.-Philippine relationship has gone through a number of ups and downs, renegotiations. You seem to suggest, Ambassador Hubbard, that we could do without the bases and then come to these other arrangements. Renato is suggesting that it would not be advisable, but you could have a security partnership that doesn't have these benefits. But can you really de-link, for example, bases from the MDT? I mean, it seems to me that without the integrated nature of the alliance, you get suboptimal outcomes on deterrence, on signaling, on symbols. In other words, it doesn't have to be old big bases, Subic Bay, Clark era. I mean, that era may be over. But without an integrated commitment, ability to exercise, and the deterrence value in MDT, it's a bit of a cobbled together arrangement, which doesn't have the core effects that you both seem to want, which is the deterrent effect, the symbolic effect, and the practical outcomes. Can you maybe help me understand that? Either or both of you?
Well, let me start by saying, Satu, we don't have bases. We haven't had bases since 1992. And what we've been looking for, groping for, is a way of sort of regularizing and formalizing defense cooperation below the level of bases. And for example, and this has been facilitated by the VFA and still more by the EDCA, which thus far has not really been fully implemented. But the idea is in helping in Mindanao. We don't have U.S. bases in Mindanao, but we do have rotational forces that are there pretty much 100% of the time, training Filipinos and preserving our joint interest, promoting our joint interest in curtailing terrorism. We have the VFA facilitates having our humanitarian operations in the Philippines, a country that has been very heavily affected by natural disasters, and now, incidentally, is the country in Southeast Asia most heavily affected by the coronavirus. I think there may be still room under the PFA for some cooperation in dealing with that scourge. But no, I think we can do that. We don't need bases, but it is different. I have long thought that if we still had our bases in Subic and Clark, the Chinese would probably have been less aggressive than they have been in building up the South China Sea in a military way. That's over the dam. The Filipinos made it their decision. We accepted their decision to close the permanent bases. But I think we do benefit from our cooperation. And as Renato said, perhaps the Chinese activities have been limited, have been contained to a certain degree by the fact of this continued partnership. I think it really would be a mistake to give it up.
Do you want to make a comment, or do you want to hold off until I post some of the questions from the Q&A section?
Just a short comment.
Sure.
A few years after the last Marine left Subic Naval Base, I still remember this, the commander of PACOM at the time, Admiral Larson, made this comment. How could basically guarantee your security if you have deprived us facilities for which American forces could honor the treaty commitment? But, since 1994, we were able to find ways to basically ensure that the alliance is still alive, military exercises, at least temporary deployment of American forces every now and then possibly if EDCA could have been implemented properly, we would have greater access arrangements. But, situation changed after 2016.
Thank you. Let me go to Q&A. We have some minutes for that, so we'll try to take them. And please forgive me for those who have entered questions. I am going to consolidate a couple. One theme that seems to be emerging around the questions, and several people have referred to it in different ways, is what after President Duterte? I mean, where will things go in the Philippine debate? Someone asks in particular, what is the balance between the presidential authority about these issues and the Senate and the armed forces of the Philippines? I mean, how will they play a role in the outcome? So could you comment a little bit on what you foresee in the forward picture on the Philippine side?
First one regarding the election, it will depend on who will be elected next presidential election. People here are starting to talk about Manchurian candidate, possibly electing him. So people who are basically critical of greater Chinese presence here don't want to have a Manchurian candidate being elected. So this will be the election in 2022 will be very crucial, not only here, but of course how it will be viewed in Washington and Tokyo and Canberra and Delhi, and also being viewed from Beijing. A second question regarding the presidential prerogative, this being challenged by the Philippine Senate. After, of course, President Duterte announced that you will have the termination of visiting force agreement, you have the Senate President filing the Senate coming out with a resolution. Then later on, you have a legal challenge being poised by the Philippine Senate in the Philippine Supreme Court, clarifying what is basically the limits of the presidential prerogative in abrogating treaties, especially after treaties had already been concurred to by the Senate. I don't know what's the arrangement in the United States. Does the American president has that prerogative to, just abrogate a treaty that has been concurred to by the United States Senate? So this is a legal challenge poised by the Philippine Senate. But of course, the greater challenge came from the Department of Foreign Affairs and of course from the Department of Defense, who basically impressed upon the president, even before he made that decision, the visiting forces agreement is of course very important. Of course, I did not mention what happened last June. That Secretary Locsin announced that there'll be a 1-year suspension on the termination of the visiting forces agreement. So at least that's a sort of a stopgap measure on before how the two allies would basically determine what will be the future of visiting forces agreement. I hope I answered those questions.
Thank you, Renato. Ambassador Hubbard, may I ask you, because a couple of the questions here refer also to what might happen on the U.S. side. Obviously, we have an upcoming election. Yeah. So maybe you could say a little bit, not just about election outcome and who will be president, that kind of thing, but more in the nature of what you see as What one colleague here has asked is a seeming shift in the U.S. military strategy away from forward basing to flexible distant force projection favors a less committed alignment than a treaty alliance. He posits this. So do you see any bandwidth on the U.S. side for, yeah, sure, that's fine. We can go along with this because our strategy is evolving as well. Please, make comments maybe from your side about where the U.S. thinking is on this.
Yeah, well, Satu, I've been out of government now for more than 15 years, and so I don't think I'm really not plugged into the thinking on the military side. But I have been observing politics and actually helping to deal with alliances not only in the Philippines but in Korea, Japan, and elsewhere. We have a very strange circumstance, I think, now, because we have in the Philippines really the first Filipino president who really, quite frankly, just doesn't much like dealing with the United States, and has been trying very actively to expand Philippines' ties with China, Russia. I'm not sure what he's gotten from that effort to expand ties, but he is not automatically pro the United States and thinking through the Philippines' interests. And we also have in the United States for the first time, I think, a president who just doesn't really much believe in alliances. He has been he has been trying to reduce U.S. involvement overseas. He's questioned some of the fundamentals, even of NATO, but of our alliances with Japan, Korea, etc. We have on both sides, leadership that doesn't really favor the kind of close alliance ties that we have supported throughout the whole post-World War II era. But we have an election coming up in November in the United States. I think, from what I know of Secretary Biden and the kind of people who will replace him, they fully support alliances. See our alliances as a way of dealing with external challenges rather than a sort of a transactional deal that promotes sort of current interests. So I think we'll have a change in perspective on the U.S. side. It does seem to me that for the most part, most countries don't really like to have foreign forces in their countries. Philippines, we have a lot of historical baggage of that. I think Filipinos have liked having the kind of arrangements we've had since the Bases Treaty was abrogated, and even in places like Korea and Japan, they want the U.S. presence, but they don't like dealing with some of the problems that revolve from that. So I think there is going to be naturally a temptation to, just as we're those of us dealing with foreign affairs have spent the last 6 months looking at these computer monitors rather than sitting down and drinking together. There are going to be some changes in how we manage our military relationships, and that's inevitable.
Thank you very much. Let me ask another question that's come up in the Q&A, and that relates to Michael Anderson has asked, and you referred to this, Renato, a bit, about the new policy statements of Mr. Pompeo a summer ago, which you said was not new, but a reiteration in a different context. But there's also been the new South China Sea statement, which has been a little bit more clear about the U.S. position. Another colleague in a different setting had put this as two new baselines that the U.S. cannot kind of walk away from. I mean, no new administration or a returning Trump administration would walk away from these new baselines. What has been the response in the Philippines to these new statements, both Mr. Pompeo's and the recent statement on the South China Sea? Has that provided more assurance? What are the attitudes?
Well, you don't have any public statement from either Secretary Locsin and Lorenzana about them. Well, Secretary Locsin came out with a statement regarding Secretary Pompeo's assurance. He said, this is good enough. There's no need for a review, in contrast to what Secretary Locsin said. But one thing we have noticed ever since Secretary Pompeo came out with that July 13 statement regarding the South China Sea, the Department of Foreign Affairs has been coming out with a lot of diplomatic protests against China. So the most recent one, of course, was a diplomatic protest regarding the confiscation of Filipino fishermen's equipment, and of course a warning by the Chinese on overflights by the Philippine Air Force. And this is what has been coming out, and supported later by Secretary Lorenzana. In a way, it has emboldened the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Foreign Affairs to be more articulate regarding our, displeasure on Chinese actions in the South China Sea. But don't expect the Philippine government, especially the president, to clap his hand. Forget it. I think that's been the standard reaction among ASEAN countries. Statement is welcome, but don't expect us to clap our hands.
Sure. Let me follow up on that, because there's another question in the queue here about specifically the armed forces of the Philippines and their support for the VFA and closer outreach to China and Russia. Could you say a little bit more about how they're reacting, given their equities in training, exercises, equipment, all of those things that matter to an armed force?
I'll give you two instances. Number one, during the height of the Marawi siege in 2014, the Chinese gave assault rifles, sniper rifles, and machine guns. You have, of course, a press conference. The president was there. After, of course, the president left, the Armed Forces of the Philippines announced we're donating all this equipment to the Philippine National Police. Simply because they could not use Chinese-made weapons. They'd gotten used to American-made assault rifles, although they might be old. Those old M16s that they're still using, still reliable in contrast to the modern Chinese assault rifle, simply because I could not read their instructions. Then, of course, you have the instruction by no less than President Duterte to acquire Kilo-class submarines from Russia and heavy lift helicopters. They never happened. And the Secretary Lorenzana said, after enjoying Russian hospitality in Vladivostok, when they came back, he said, we'll be having problem in terms of financing, because no banks would allow us to conduct transaction with Russia, because Russia is under, an embargo. So that ends those efforts to acquire Russian-made weapons. So this tells us how basically the Armed Forces of the Philippines would listen to presidential instruction. Whether they would comply or not, of course, is another matter.
Okay, thank you. We're now at 10:01, so let me just ask both of you to make some concluding remarks, please, about key takeaways that you'd like us to have about this potential transition that was raised very interestingly in your title. You basically gave the disadvantages, Renato, of this, but maybe you can, in your closing, offer what you think is the state of the debate in the Philippines, and then I'd ask Ambassador as well to make some comments.
Well, when I wrote that paper, you had a crisis. February, this crisis has been mitigated by the decision, but I don't think that will be the last crisis. I think a greater crisis would happen by January or February 2021, just in case you'll have a change of occupants in the White House, because you'll also have a change in terms not only of the value of the alliances, but terms of the alliance per se, but also values that you expect from your allies. I think everybody knows what I mean. Expect your allies to adhere to democratic values, rule of law, respect for human rights. You just don't accept anyone to be considered as a security partner. So I think this happened before 2000. Before you have a change in administration. So I expect, again, this will not be, what happened in February will not be the last crisis that this alliance would encounter.
So Renato, let me press you a little bit just to clarify my understanding. So in the wake of the U.S. elections and what you seem to be hinting at as change in the U.S. administration will be more of a focus on the human rights element of the U.S.-Philippine relationship. Is that your expectation?
I think that's expectation. Once you have, of course, somebody from the establishment, Joe Biden, supposedly from the establishment, and somebody from, of course, the Democratic Party.
So your expectation is that alliance relations, therefore, will remain as difficult to manage?
Difficult will be more difficult, yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understood what your point is. So, in other words, the current difficulties in the alliance that we're facing, whether on the VFA or implementation of EDCA or what have you, you expect to continue, but for maybe slightly different reasons than they are continuing today. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Ambassador Hubbard, may I ask you please to have the last word and make any other comments you'd like before I close the session?
Well, thank you. Let me first pick up where Renato left off. I do think that a Democratic administration will probably be more critical of Duterte's approach to human rights and the narcotics problem and the issues of democracy than the Trump administration has been, and that may lead to some frictions going forward. For example, I think Democrats would probably, I think all of us would like to see a free trade agreement between the U.S. and the Philippines, but I think that would be hampered by a perception, and is even now in the Congress, a perception that human rights are being violated in very major ways in the Philippines. I think the Trump administration has been more tolerant, but in a way, I would say this illustrates the value of the treaty alliance. That it is a permanent basis for security cooperation that kind of exists above and apart from the various issues that arise from time to time. We managed to the MDT survived the Marcos administration. It has survived various administrations that have replaced Marcos, and now here we are with sort of, I guess I would describe Duterte as a populist leader who I think it's worth continuing as an ongoing basis to promote our common interests. But finally, let me just add, also came up, I think, sort of implicitly in Satu, your mention of the recent Pompeo statement. That is, we really haven't talked about UN tribunal decision, basically declaring Chinese claims over at the 9-dash line, et cetera, as being invalid.
Right.
Pompeo kind of went beyond that to declare them illegal. I'm not there. I think there is a distinction there, but I think that UN tribunal decision should be a very solid basis for moving forward and the post-Trump and post-Duterte era. Thank you very much. This has been I've enjoyed being here with Renato again.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hubbard. And I really like that, that maybe the way I take away from this is, at least from your two perspectives, that that the MDT is a good permanent basis for the U.S.-Philippine relationship in the absence of permanent bases. And that may be a way of formulating, I think, a useful way of thinking about what you two have been saying, at least what I took away. But I want to thank you again. But before I do want to take an opportunity to make a quick announcement about upcoming programs. As you know, please join our newsletter and or our social media avenues for keeping up to date on all the wonderful programs such as this one. But coming up later this week on the 25th, that's tomorrow, from 11 to 12, we have two leading trade economists, Dr. Peter Petrie, the Shapiro Chair of Economics at Brandeis University, and Michael Plummer of Johns Hopkins, talking about the U.S. economic position in Asia, quite apart from alliances. How are we doing in light of CPTPP and RCEP and related issues of decoupling from China, et cetera? So they'll be looking through that based on a new Peterson Institute for International Economics article they've written. And then dealing with quite a different kind of U.S. relationship, that with Israel. We have an Israeli expert on China, Yoram Evron, who is a graduate alumnus of our East-West Center Fellowship, talking about new challenges to the China-Israel-U.S. relationship. And that's on the 27th at 10 a.m. So just if you're interested, or your colleagues, please pass those along and again, join us for future programming. And with that, let me thank again Renato for staying up late in the Philippines and joining us in late your evening. To Ambassador Hubbard on a Monday morning, it's thank you so much for joining us first thing. And for all of the participants who joined today via YouTube or Zoom, thank you for participating in the East-West Center's programs and webinars. And we wish you a good day and all health as we move forward. Thank you so much and have a good evening and day. Bye-bye.
See you next year, Satu.
Of course, with pleasure. With pleasure, Renato. I can't wait to see you in person again. And Ambassador Hubbard, same.
Good to see you.
Bye-bye.